Welcome to Journaling with Nature, the podcast for those who want to turn curiosity into wonder, a pencil sketch into a rabbit hole of discovery, a moment of stillness into a life full of joy. I'm your host, Bethan Burton. Let's open the pages of our nature journals and explore this world together. Hello, this is episode 21. Today's conversation is a special treat for me because I had the privilege of interviewing my favourite professor from my university days. I met Professor Roger Kitching in 2001 when he lectured me for a biology class during the first year of my undergraduate degree, which was in ecology and conservation biology. When I contacted him to ask if he would come on a podcast all about nature journaling, Roger happily agreed, and then he directed me to a book called Field Notes on Science and Nature, which is a collection of essays from different scientists detailing their experiences keeping field journals. The book is edited by Michael Canfield with a foreword by E.O. Wilson, and I definitely recommend you check it out. It's extremely interesting for anyone who loves nature journals and field journals. Professor Kitching has a wonderful chapter in this book where he talks about how he uses the details captured in his field notebooks to create a more polished piece of writing for a publication. In his essay, he also writes about the experience of evacuating a student with a broken leg from a very isolated field station in Borneo. It was to this same field station in the forest of Brunei where Roger took the first group of students from Griffith University in 2002. I was lucky enough to be part of this amazing field trip, and we talk about it during our conversation. When I record these podcast interviews, it's a video chat, so I can see my guests, even though it's only the audio that's recorded. You'll hear during my conversation with Roger that we are holding up our actual field notebooks to show each other. There was something about having these special books there in front of us was so much fun. I actually found inside the cover of mine the post-it notes that Roger had left in the front of my journals when he marked them almost 20 years ago. We also talked about some naturalists from history, and just for a little bit of context for those who aren't familiar with this story, there was a British naturalist and explorer named Alfred Russel Wallace who was born in 1823 and died in 1913. He did a lot of fieldwork in the Amazon rainforest and later in the Malay archipelago, Singapore, Malaysia and Indonesia. Through his observations in the field, he made the biogeographical observation that this area seemed to be the point of transition between animals characteristic of tropical Asia and those that have an Australian origin, namely marsupials and monotremes. Wallace actually drew a line on the map dividing Bali from Lombok and Borneo from Sulawesi, noting that to the west of this line there was Asian fauna, and to the east you begin to see Australian species. This is known as the Wallace Line. Wallace is also famous for having discovered independently the mechanism behind natural selection and speciation while living in the forest in Malaysia, and he posted his essay on the subject off to his scientific friend and mentor Charles Darwin. And meanwhile, Darwin, who had made this very same discovery many years earlier before Wallace, but who had been too conflicted to publish his ideas, then realized that he had to immediately publish his theory of evolution by natural selection if he didn't want to be usurped completely, even though that wasn't Wallace's intention. Anyway, we touch on these events during the interview, so that's just a little bit of context about Wallace and Darwin to set the scene. So let's get into the interview. Professor Kitching grew up in the port city of Hull in North Yorkshire, England, and was a keen naturalist from a very young age. I began by asking about these early nature experiences.
It is a very strange fact that I was always obsessed with animals. I mean, obsessed. I was passionate about knowing about them, not just, sort of cuddling the pussycat, but actually accumulating all of this animal trivia. And that's, in a way, rather unusual because I came from a working class family. My father was a warehouse man. My mother was a housewife. I was I am the first university graduate in our extended family. Not only that, we lived in a government housing estate, as we'd say in Australia, a council estate in Yorkshire, in a city, in a suburb. Now, it wasn't far to walk from there into countryside or into fields and so on. But the other great obsession was collecting things. And I mean, I suppose that's why I ended up as an entomologist. But I started off like most kids did in England in those days, collecting birds' eggs, but not for very long. But then shells, fossils, fungal spore prints. What else did I collect? Pressed flowers. Whatever, anything that could be collected, until eventually when I was 13 I got round to insects. I had tried butterflies and moths, so to speak, a couple of years earlier, but the technicalities involved in collecting them and preserving them and the equipment you needed, because we certainly didn't have the money for equipment. I bought my first butterfly net with the money I got from selling a second-hand banjo.
Really?
My father used to run jumble sales, and he would get all sorts of stuff, and they would come to our house, and then periodically there would be this sale for the trades association that he belonged to and was involved with. Anyway, this banjo turned up, and I grabbed it and took possession of it, and I restrung it. I actually got to teach yourself how to play the banjo, and then I realized, A, it was very difficult, and B, I wasn't at all musical, and that was borne out subsequently. So I took it to this shop that used to sell things for people, I suppose a little bit like a pawnbroker, and they put it in the window, and it sold. And I immediately bought a postal order, sent it off to the entomological supply place in the south of England, got this fantastic butterfly net. And I guess I was about 12 or 13 when that happened. And we went from there. So look, there's a lot of those, but I was always passionate about it. And I read, and I read, and I read, and I read, and I've still got the books. I mean, my parents were not very literate, and they certainly weren't intellectual, but they encouraged me, and my brother for that matter, but I was the academic one. So I have the Field Guide to the Birds of Britain, which is a serious book. It's not a kid's book. And it says in the front, with love from Uncle somebody or other, who no doubt just handed over the money. And that was when I was 8. Because 1953 it says, there's a date in it, and that was when I was 8. So that interest had become serious. Now I didn't go out and recognize a lot. I went and looked at a lot of birds, but I wasn't very good at you need experts with you. But by the end of a year I'd learned every name, every single one, including all the unlikely rare migrants and all vagrants and that sort of thing. But then when I was 14, one of our neighbours had seen me pottering around in the garden with a butterfly net, and he was in the city naturalist club, the sort of amateur, which was a very northern thing, because it was mostly bird watchers and botanists and photographers and things. Anyway, he came to see my father, and he said he'd noticed the lad, as he called him, with a butterfly net, and he really and that was one of the key points, because for the first time I met professional biologists, mostly teachers, but one or two people from the local university. And the other thing that was brilliant was I went through the English grammar school system, which was this, well, it doesn't exist anymore, was this entirely meritocratic, one fail and you're out sort of deal. But I was very academic, so it wasn't a problem. And they had an extremely good head of biology there. And, everything flowed from there. And I did well at school, went to university and all the rest of it, but always with this passion for nature, which is still there. I mean, I
Yes.
wander around this place that we live every day looking for bugs or looking at birds or trying to figure out what how to tell one gum tree from another, this sort of thing. So, but I don't know why this is. I mean, my parents were not particularly interested. They were encouraging, but they were just as encouraging of my brother, who was a train spotter, for God's sake. So, it's just one of those things. Something clicked.
It's inbuilt. It's inside you.
Yep. And as soon as I learned the word zoologist, I said, well, that's what I wanted to be. And my parents would say, well, what are you actually going to do for a living? And I had no idea. And just that this, and I did a degree in zoology and botany, but majoring in zoology, and then a PhD in all the usual academic stuff. And of course, then I realized that, well, in fact, there were all sorts of jobs that people like me did, not just academic, and it went from there.
Yeah, and so during these years when you were studying at Imperial College London and in University of Oxford, you began to start your life as a professional, and you started to go out and do various expeditions, and in these years you started keeping your first field journals, your first field notebooks.
No, well, yes and no. I mean, I had already kept diaries. Starting in 1960. This is 1961. And this was, what I did at school every day and this sort of thing.
Yes.
And it was an obsessive thing, and I did it for 3.5 years. And as I went into my sort of equivalent grade 12 exams, I stopped, and there were other things. Imperial College, though, was a wonderful place to be a zoology student. There were only 12 of us in the year, and Imperial College was famous for its exploration club. And so every year, groups would get together and decide to go somewhere outrageous. In my case, Ethiopia. Ethiopia, old Ethiopia, the Ethiopian empire with Haile Selassie in charge. And
was it your first time out of England?
No, not quite. I had been to France on an exchange when I was learning French. And I'd also been to Holland when I was 7. In fact, that's when I gave my first lecture, because my father's trade organization, because Hull was the port from which the ferry boats went across to Holland.
Yes, I've caught that ferry myself.
Yeah, from Hull to Rotterdam. And you could do these little trips where you got on one way, spent 3 days there and came back. And it was I had no idea it was very cheap. But my father's trade organization organized a tour. And my father took me on that trip. I do remember, because we went to this huge bird park. And my father was one of the organizers. He was very good at organizing things. And I persuaded him that we had to go to a zoo of some sort. And we went to this place called Avifauna. In I don't know where it was, The Hague or somewhere like that. And that was where I first learned the word avifauna. But not only that, when I came back, I was 7, so I was still in primary school. When I came back, it was very, very unusual for kids to travel in those days, other than to the sort of caravans on the coast or whatever. So the teacher picked me up and stood me on the desk and said, "Tell us about it." So I lectured the class about, and I did for, I don't know how long, but at least half an hour. So I always had the gift of the gab, fortunately.
You did.
But anyway, back
Sorry,
to
I interrupted you. Yes, go back to Ethiopia.
So a group of us got together, and we were originally going to go to what is now Botswana, but we got diverted because you had to have a project. You had to have something that was at least quasi-scientific. And 4 of us in the end raised money, got some support from the uni, and for 3.5 months we went to northern Ethiopia, to Lake Tana, and we lived in a village of a minority tribe called the Waito, and we did what would now be called human ecology. We mapped the village. I studied the agriculture and the fishing. It was a fishing village and that sort of thing. And I kept a journal. Here it is.
Wow.
But I didn't keep it going. I kept it going for 60 days. The last entry in here says 61st day. 61st day, the 26th of August, 1965. And then I got engaged in other things on the expedition. And I got back and I deeply regretted that, because although I can remember what happened subsequently, I can't sort it out by days. So the following year, I went to, we organized a little private expedition with some friends, and we went to the Arctic. And this time I determined to persevere. There you are, there it is, complete with a pressed leaf from Finnish Lapland, probably illegally imported into Australia as vegetable matter. So, you know, I'd read Darwin, and I'd read Wallace, and I'd read all sorts of other people, and I still do. And they were keeping journals. And then what they did, and later this is what I found journals were essential for, they turned them into pocket accounts. You know, very few people, unless you're Darwin or Wallace, as famous as that, nobody ever publishes the journal as such, but they use it as a base for constructing stories. So, for instance, the chapter that was in Field Notes, the book we were talking about, is a combination of 2 sets of events, one of which was based on a journal and one of which was the early stuff in Hull, which was actually partly based on the day-to-day events that are recorded in here, including what beetles I found on the Naturalist Society field trips. It's all in here. And I read it, and that day is back there in my head, even though most of it says, went to school, did double maths and whatever. At the weekends, it either describes my early dates with various young ladies, or, well, it does, but not in a very cute and restricted style, shall we say. But it also says I went to such and such a place with the Naturalist Club, found such and such a beetle. In fact, one of those pictures you can see on the wall behind me is a painting I did quite recently of one of the beetles I found on one of those expeditions. Anyway.
All those years ago. That's wonderful. That's wonderful that those memories can be absolutely preserved so fresh in your mind.
Exactly. And now I've got...
Through decades.
Yeah.
They become an absolutely invaluable treasure.
Absolutely.
That stack of journals.
They become memory extenders, basically. But they're much more than that, because often, as anybody who's kept a journal knows, you don't write about everything, and you don't necessarily go off onto long sort of philosophical rants, because apart from anything else, if you've been on a field expedition, by the end of the day, when you've got to write your diary, you're absolutely exhausted, and
Yes.
at best you can, and sometimes you've got 2 or 3 days to catch up on. It's really not a time when you want to sit down and write long essays about how you feel and reflections on. That all comes later. But it's all, the facts are there, and you can go back to them.
In those early ones, in the beginning from Ethiopia and the Arctic, were you keeping sketches as well as accounts, or mostly using words?
I often did little thumbnails just with my pen, but it wasn't. And what happened after I finished uni, I went to, first of all, I was a research fellow in Canada for just 2 years, and did some traveling there in Western Canada, all different parts of the States and Mexico. And I didn't keep diaries. I dearly wish I had, but everything was new. I was newly married. There were two of us. Dropping out every day for an hour or half an hour to do a diary wasn't one of the options. And then we came to Australia. And again, now we had kids. And there were two, while I worked for CSIRO in Canberra, there were two major expeditions, well, field trips, other than what I was doing for a living, which was sampling blowflies in the southern tablelands, which wasn't something you necessarily wanted to record the details of, other than in data books. But I did go to New Guinea for the first time, and went into the highlands collecting butterflies with a guy who's become a good friend of mine subsequently, Don Sands. But I also was part of the Alligator Rivers Survey Expedition in 1971, which went up to what is now Kakadu, but was then just Western Arnhem Land, to do a biological survey. CSIRO were contracted to do this. And we went in there, into that country, when it was just 2 wheel tracks through the grass to get there. All of these famous indigenous sites and art sites and burial sites, all sorts of places that we probably shouldn't have been, were just there in the grass, so to speak, or in the rock formations. But I didn't keep a diary, and that is my greatest regret. And that set me up so that when the next major opportunity came up, which was sometime later, was to go on the Project Wallace expedition to Sulawesi in 1985 now, I absolutely decided I would keep a journal and keep it assiduously. And that's when drawings began to become more of a feature. And they gradually developed. There were either little thumbnail sketches just with a pen, or later, by the time you and I met and I was working in Borneo, then I'd worked a little bit on my artwork and was doing watercolors and then subsequently gouaches. And I continued to do that. But many of the more recent trips, there just frankly hasn't been the leisure to do that. Because it's all very, if I am doing a painting, then generally I can do a quick line sketch without any problem, just in pencil or pen. But if it's going to be a painting, then I'm not much of an artist. I have to divide the thing up into squares and all that sort of thing in order to transfer an image, usually. Because once we got digital images, then it became quite different. But what I've never done, almost never done, is used photographs. I take them, but the idea of going back and printing them off and going and
Pasting them in the journal.
leaving spaces for them and all the rest of it, no, that's not. That becomes a scrapbook, not a journal. You know, a journal's something you do while you're out there. I mean, generally when I climbed on the plane to come home from wherever, that was the end of the journal.
Yes.
I mean, I didn't sit down at home and write more of the journal. I might have written an article or a paper or something that described the results. Sometimes, in fact, I certainly, in the big book I wrote about food webs, I did use the journals to introduce sections of that book with a sort of atmospheric piece.
A narrative.
And that was derived from the journals. But again, it wasn't the actual words of the journals.
I like that, what you said in your book, in your essay in Field Notes on Science and Nature, that you have 3 layers of writing. So the first one is the field notebook, where all the data goes in,
the
everything
numbers,
the numbers,
basically.
exactly. And then the second layer is your journal, which is the daily accounts, the drawings, the events, the thoughts and observations. And then there's the publication. So a journal article, or maybe a magazine or a book. I love that. And the journal is like really key to inform the more polished end result, which is...
Absolutely. And, you know, when you write a boring numerical description of results or interpretation of results, there comes a point in there when you have to say, we set our light traps on, and you've put the dates in. You think, cripes, what were the dates? And then they weren't in the notebook, but they're in the journal. And you go scraping through to find exactly that. Because if you're writing popular articles, and I always intended to write a full popular book, which I think I already have sort of half written, but it comes and it goes. And that's very much, that sort of 1 chapter per expedition. Whether that will ever get finished, frankly, Beth and I don't know. I pull it up occasionally and write a few paragraphs. I think if I had a publisher, I would probably get off my rear and finish it, because it wouldn't be that hard, because a lot of it's done. You know, I'd have to go through and change things where I say, now 30 years later, it would now be 40 years later or something.
I want to read that book, Roger, so do it.
Yes, I mean, other people, it's now become a bit of a genre.
Yes, it has,
writing up, not like Michael Camfield's book. That's a compilation, the Field Notes book. But my very good friend Wojciech Novotny, who's in the Czech Republic and has worked all his working life in Papua New Guinea, and has probably got closer to the way of life in Papua New Guinea than any other biologist. And indeed, it's him I'm going to work with for 3 months next year, COVID permitting. But he has written a wonderful book called Field Notes from New Guinea, which he wrote in his native Czech, and then had an expert translate it into English. Normally he writes in English, but that's a whole series of little essays, reflections on. It's not really about biology at all. It's about how he compares, he contrasts belonging to a small tribe in Europe, by which he means the Czechs, with the tribal life in Papua New Guinea, and and some really, really amusing comparisons. That's the sort of book I'd like to write, but I
Yes.
don't think I tend to get too serious, you know. Um, what you have to try and do is use the journals to talk about an expedition, but you can't
Yes.
write a book with, well, not anymore. Attenborough and Durrell and people did this in their early careers, which was really just an animated journal, you know. Then we
Yeah.
moved here and did this and so on. That doesn't work anymore. You've got to have a point to each chapter, and that means you, certainly in the present state of the world, you tend to get into serious stuff
Yes.
about habitat destruction. I mean,
Climate change. Yeah.
finally, Attenborough, who, when I worked with Attenborough, he said to me he didn't get into all that conservation stuff because whatever job he had to do, he would go to the best place in the world for seeing gorillas or filming coral reefs. Well, he changed. He changed his mind, obviously, and the latest book is absolutely a rather depressing
Yes.
reflection on his part on how he's seen nature deteriorate over his working career. Fortunately, I think in terms of the joy of nature, when I worked with him all 30 years ago.
Tell me the story because I didn't know.
Just for a weekend.
Okay.
He came to Lamington National Park to film bowerbirds. This was when they were producing the series Trials of Life, which was the second set of films they made in the new style. The first one was Life on Earth, and the second one was Trials of Life. And he was going to then move on to film caterpillar ant interactions, and in other words, talk about mutualisms where both species engaged in a two-way interaction benefited from that. And I had done the basic work on that as a part of my entomological research. Oh, long before you and I met. I mean, it was very early days at Griffith, so in the mid-70s. And so while he was filming bowerbirds at Lamington, the team, the BBC, invited me to go and spend a weekend there with them, during which time I was supposed to brief him and tell him all about the caterpillar stuff, which he actually filmed in Townsville with an ex-student of mine called Chris Hill. But I spent the entire weekend at Lamington with them, and it was fantastic. And he was just an amazingly empathetic sort of person, as well as being interesting and remarkably literate and all the rest of it. So that was very exciting. I didn't keep a journal about that, but I often wonder whether he kept journals, because he always wrote books. Because I know what he did, how it worked in his case was, we would, in between filming the bowerbirds, we would sit down together in the lodge there, and I would tell him all about whatever butterfly ant interactions, and he would immediately write the script.
Really?
I mean, not at the same time, but immediately afterwards. And he would work on it late in the night while he was, and I mean, that was his brilliance, because he wrote all his own scripts and he wrote them on the go. I mean, so they would go out and they would see what the bowerbird was doing, and I mean, he would know the basic biology of the bowerbird. But the actual script, what he actually said, you know, that wonderful English voice, which so many people try and imitate now, especially people trying to sell things on television ads. You can just tell that this is, when they say, now the children are foraging for the chocolates. It's Attenborough down the line, it really is. How anybody will ever match that, I don't know. But anyway, he would go and make some observations, do part of the film, and then rush back in and write some more of the script, because
Oh, wow.
obviously he would have been, because when you're looking at wild nature, you don't always get what you want, but you always get something else, and you have to make something of
He's
that.
learning on the
you
spot.
know.
Yeah, yeah,
Absolutely.
okay,
And
yeah.
he was just so impressive. He still is impressive. I only met
Yes.
him the once, I might add. Oh no, twice. Once when I was a student, and he came and talked to the University Natural History Society just after he'd come back from Madagascar, and then 40 years later, or whatever it was, 30 years later, when he was doing Trials of Life. But it's such a nice man. I met a lot of these TV naturalists, and they're not, without naming names, they're not necessarily very nice people off screen.
Okay.
But David was just a pleasure to be with.
I love that story. I haven't heard that before.
I've got a lot of stories.
You've got... So for context, let's talk about how we met. So in my first year of university, which was 2001, oh my gosh, I met you because you were my biology professor. And your secret way of getting people to pay attention in class was to offer the students with the top results at the end of the term the chance to go on a field trip to Borneo. That was a cheeky trick, right?
In 2001, Bethany, it wasn't quite like that. And this is absolutely true. I was lecturing you and your class, I forget about what, but it was my habit to break up the material stuff that you were supposed to know with stories about
Yes.
my field work in various places. And I had been talking, I think, about Brunei and pitcher plants and the animals that live in and around pitcher plants. And people were clearly interested. And without any forethought in the middle of the lecture, I said, and I will take 18 of you there next summer. There was no pre-planning beyond that point.
I didn't know that. You did it on the spot.
I mean, subsequently it became. They still go. It's become an absolute ritual now every year, and I did it for 13 years. But that very first one was utterly spontaneous, and as
That's
you
incredible.
recollect,
I had no idea. I remember the moment. I remember when you said it.
Yeah,
because my mouth went, huh? What?
yeah, well, that's right. And there must have been, 150 people in the class in that first year lecture. And I said, I mean, I made it up as I went along. I said, look, go to the office, and if you'd like to come, sign up. And somebody said to me, Prof, how are you going to decide who goes? I said, well, I'll take the order of merit list, and I'll compare that with the people who want to go, and I'll take the best 18. And I did that for years. It wasn't approved of by the university because it was meritocratic. God forbid a university should be meritocratic. But of course, it totally changed that class from that point on. I mean, there were people who told me that it, subsequently, because I think it turned out more like 20 people every year for 13 years. So that's nearly 300 people who went to Borneo with me. And there were many people who came along, and I said, well, look, you've got to get a high distinction or something like that. And that'll be really good because you'll go on and get into second year. And they would say, we don't give a damn about that. We just want to go to Borneo. And there were even people who signed up for the degree explicitly because they could go to Borneo. Or so they said. They may have just been sucking up to me. I don't know. But yeah.
Well, I remember that moment when you said that in class. I
Yeah.
remember it so clearly because I was like, I have to go on this trip. And I focused so hard. I dropped everything else and I was focusing. My goal that first semester was I've got to achieve in this biology
Several
class.
of my colleagues complained that people had stopped working in their units because they were spending all their time on the biology stuff. But I mean, my task was to not only get people engaged with biology, which I certainly did, but also to inspire them to think, let them realize that they might be learning about the segmentation of the annelids, but this was real and that it was out there, and the connection was with Wallace or whomever, or Humboldt or me sloshing around in a rainforest.
Yeah.
I mean, there were a couple of people who came on those trips who had been turned on by Attenborough and other people about rainforests, and when they got there, one or two of them actually came to me and said, I really can't handle this. And there were lots of reasons for that, but they said I didn't realize it would be so spiky or wet or
So
muddy
smelly.
or generally sweaty,
Yes, I remember. So I was in amongst those 18, and you took us to the rainforest in Brunei, and it was and is one of the most amazing things that have ever happened in my life. It was so incredible. And that was where I first kept my first field journal, my first nature journal. But I do remember you telling us, like, bring some clothes that you are happy to put in the bin on the way to the airport because you're going to get muddy. You're going to smell like an old shoe and whatever.
But some people couldn't. Some people couldn't handle that, and I mean, we could.
Yeah.
Well, actually, we only did 2 trips to Brunei, and then we moved to Sabah, which in many ways was far more civilized. The facilities in Brunei were fairly basic, as you'll recollect. And
Can you talk about that? So we were in Kuala Belalong Field Study Centre, and we had to go on a big journey to get there. We had to go first on a motorboat, and then on a bus, I think, and then on a longboat. It was in the middle of nowhere. Can you talk a little bit about the Field Study Centre?
The thing about the Sultanate of Brunei is that it's in 2 parts. There's the main part where the capital, Bandar Seri Begawan, is, and that's where the airport is, and it's where you fly into. But then there is a river called the Limbang, the banks of which are actually Malaysian. They belong to Sarawak, not to Brunei. And then there's a long, thin bit of Brunei in the east, which is called Temburong. And that is mostly undeveloped. And that's where a lot of the very good forest is. And of course, because the country is so oil rich, it hasn't cut the forest down the way that, say, has happened in much of Sarawak and Sabah. And the University of Brunei had set up a field station for their use, but also for international use, up the Belalong River and the Kuala Belalong, which is where the Temburong River and the Belalong River met. Kuala means confluence, as in Kuala Lumpur and all the rest of it. But now, in order to get there, therefore, you flew into the capital on an international jet. We usually spent 1 night there, I think. And then you had to get a motorboat, which took you out into the mangroves, crocodile country, but also proboscis monkey country.
Yes.
And you had to go through a little bit of Malaysian waters and then up the river to a place called Bangar, not Bandar. And in Bangar, you disembarked, and then there was a short, I think we borrowed the local school bus to go for about 20 minutes to a longhouse, an Iban longhouse called Batanduri, where we all had to squeeze into these canoes, which were driven by outboard motors, and head upriver for what, about half an hour, 40 minutes, depending on how high the water was. And through several sets of rapids, because it wasn't a very deep river, but it was quite rocky in places. And the Iban, the local indigenous people who ran this canoe service and indeed did most of the work, in fact all the work I'd suggest, in the field station, and hence to the field station. If there was rain, and there often was very heavy rain, then the river could go from a sort of half-meter deep trickle to a raging torrent overnight.
Yes.
And this did happen several times. And if it happened to coincide with the time you had to go back, to catch airplanes and things back to Australia, then some of those journeys back down the river were quite hair-raising. I mean, it was normally a 35-minute run. I've done it in 10 minutes, almost surfing down the river, with somebody, one of the Iban in the front, with a big pole, essentially to stave you off rocks.
Away from rocks, yeah.
So it was a very, very exciting place to get to.
Yes. And once you get there, oh my gosh, it's like a different world. My memory is that everything there was either way bigger than you think it should be or way smaller. So you'd see micro squirrels or giant squirrels, or you'd see see a leaf that was bigger than you, or you'd see like the tiniest thing, or everything there was magical.
It's partly because most people had never been to a rainforest of any sort before. But the other thing, of course, was going to Borneo, especially to an almost undisturbed part of Borneo. We had flipped from the Australasian realm of nature to the tropical Asian. So all sorts of reasons why there was so much diversity. We were in a rainforest, it was tropical, we were in Asia, we were in the land of placental mammals, not marsupials. So much as I love our marsupials, they're not very diverse. Whereas, for instance, you mentioned squirrels. There were pygmy squirrels. There was Prevost squirrel, the gorgeous black one with a ginger stripe down its side. There were the pygmy squirrels. There are horsetail squirrels, and so on. And so, flying squirrels. There were 3 different sorts of flying squirrel, or more actually. There's flying lemurs, colugos. There's porcupines. I don't know if you were there when we saw a big porcupine on the way out.
Yes, I remember.
I mean, the only problem with the Kuala Balalong station is the forest or the topography is so steep that covering any sort of ground is very difficult. When we started going to Sabah, where it's much flatter, then you actually saw more wildlife. Not because there was more wildlife, it's just that there was more opportunity for seeing it.
Yeah, so the Field Studies Centre was right next to the river, and then there was steep banks on either side.
Exactly, and we did see wildlife. We saw we saw wild pigs, we saw mouse deer, we saw all sorts of stuff.
I just remember it as like
and we saw otters. Yes.
I never saw otters there, but I saw hornbills. The hornbills were out of this world, and we heard gibbons, and I just remember someone calling. Someone would call every afternoon. Look what I found, and we'd run down, and we saw the lantern. What was it that
the lantern
we drew
bugs?
The lantern bugs,
fulgorid lantern bugs. Yeah. Oh, look, it's amazing diversity of things, and that's where some of the drawings came in.
Yes.
But I moved the trip to Sabah 2 years after your trip, partly because we had had an accident in year 2 at Brunei, which wasn't, well, it could have been life-threatening, but all was well in the end. But getting somebody out of there when they were injured turned out to be an amazingly difficult thing to do. And I won't go into the detail of it. I've written about it and all the rest of it. But the Danam Valley field station at Sabah and the subsequently Malayaw Basin field station there, both of which we've used, was easy to access. You could access it by road, was the point. A very rough forest road, but you could access it by road. So that means when accidents happened, and 13 years, 300 students, accidents happen, you can respond to that without having this fourfold stages to actually get to any sort of real medical assistance. But there was a charm to Kuala Balalong simply because it wasn't that fancy,
Yes. I remember, I've just got such amazing memories of that trip. And so the students were in like a wooden
two-story
thing, and the staff were in an adjacent building. And I remember us like tiptoeing up to you guys when you were there at night, writing in your nature journals, in your field journals, drinking gin maybe out of specimen jar because it was very rustic.
The terrible thing to remember is that those specimen jars that we used all the time for our sampling, little round ones, are actually urine sample bottles. And the reason we use them is because they are so cheap. And we used hundreds of them when we were doing our research there. So, they had never been used for their original intended purpose, but you had to sort of block that from your mind while you drank your scotch or whatever it was. But, that was one of the important things about the field trip, because I always took 4 staff, sometimes with some ring-ins who paid for themselves, but there would be 4 people there. They later cut that back to 3 because the costs went up hugely globally, nothing to do with the university. And there was only 18 to 20, I think the most students we ever took was 22. And they were all smart kids because they had to be either smart or at least nerdish. I mean, they had to have worked reasonably hard to get a place on this trip. So they had to have developed an interest, even if they didn't already have one. And so we actually got to know the students very well, much more so than when you're just looking at a sea of 150 faces, where the only people you know are the 1 or 2 who ask questions, or the 1 or 2 who are so ill-behaved that you have to do something about it. And you forget them almost immediately, but you don't forget, I don't forget many of the people. Not only that, many of my very best subsequent honours and PhD students came from the Borneo crowd. They really did. Louise Ashton, who's assistant professor at University of Hong Kong now, and one of my latest students, was turned on by the Borneo trip. Sarah Maunsell, who until recently was postdoc at Harvard, with Michael Camfield, who wrote the field, not in his lab, but in the same building, again, was a Borneo bunny and went on to become a professional biologist. And that happened frequently. And that was extraordinary.
I've got my field journal here, in fact, and do you know, I've still got the little post-it note that you wrote in it, and it says this: Bethan, great pictures, good account. The best parts were where you say what you think about things. Roger, 25 out of 30.
Well, that was pretty good.
It's interesting that you say that about writing what I thought about things, because when I was keeping this book, I guess I was trying to be scientific. And
that's not what a journal. That's not what a journal is. I mean, it can have the science embedded in it. I mean, look, there are a million different ways of writing. Not a million. There are many different ways of writing a journal, but there's a fine line between, if you wish, letting it all hang out in a journal. I did get journals. And of course, I was marking these journals, which, generally speaking, when I write my journal, it's for me subsequently. Yes. Or anybody wants to read it after I'm dead, in which case I won't care. But the student ones were being written, and occasionally there would be, tensions among particular students. And one or two of them would write about this at great length. And
so you got that gossip in the journal.
I really didn't want to know that. So there's a fine line. But you said you got there and there were bigger things and smaller things and so much diversity. And that was what struck you. Well, that's a far more interesting observation than simply saying, I found a millipede and I found a spider and whatever. Yeah. Because it means you're thinking about what you saw and you're comparing it with your previous experience, which is, I mean, that would signal to me that you were responding to the environment in a way that is different from simply experiencing it in a trivial sense. But,
So then later on we had to keep another field journal for a different subject. Do you remember this? Field ecology.
Oh, yeah.
And it's got your...
Do I say the same thing?
No, you didn't.
There's only a limited number of comments you can make. Oh, look, the problem with field ecology it was very short. So you only had
1 week in Lamington National Park. But this makes me smile because I was confused about it. But I'll read it to you. It says, Bethan, as usual, an elegant and interesting journal, though your Eastern Spinebill may have more to do with Rousseau than John Gould. 23 out of 25. This is the picture.
More to do with who? Rousseau?
Rousseau than John Gould.
I don't know. I have no idea what I meant. I mean, it sounded intelligent, didn't it?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I was like, I'm not intelligent enough to understand it.
Well, Rousseau was this environmental philosopher who reflected on. Was almost. I think that's probably what I meant. That what you painted was almost the mental image of the spinebill rather than the actual spinebill. Bear in mind, John Gould painted his birds from skins, generally speaking. Mm. Anyway.
So in my
but I don't know what I was thinking at the time when I was probably very quickly marking 30 of these things while wishing I was doing something else.
I learned actually from your first comment, and I realised that I didn't have to be writing scientific things to impress you, that I needed to be writing from myself, from my own experiences, from my own heart maybe. And that second journal was different.
Did you get a better mark?
I did. It was 23 out of 25.
Well, you can't do better than that, really. Yeah. But I mean, I still keep these journals. I showed you, this is actually a diary, this first one. That was 1961. I did keep one in 1960 when I was 16, but I haven't got it. My mother threw it out with a lot of other stuff when the house was being cleared. And this one is from 2019 when I went with a film crew up to Cape Melville on Cape York. And there's, I don't know, I haven't counted them. There's about 25 volumes in between.
Wow.
Some of which stretch for a long time. I mean, the 6 months we spent at Harvard, I kept a journal throughout that period, which included many more sort of day-to-day things. But it did. I mean, that's when I was writing what I call my big book, this one. And that diary does chronicle how this was produced, chapter by chapter. And I remember a couple of times when I got absolutely stuck, and then some set of just talking with people or reading something, or sometimes just walking around in these lovely parks they have there, things would come clear in my head anyway, and then I'd go back and write them down. And the journal does sort of chronicle that intellectual process, which is interesting, as well as saying what I had for dinner at the seafood restaurant and that sort of stuff.
One thing I felt when in Borneo writing this, my very first nature journal, was a connection to naturalists in history. Like, because we were right near the Wallace Line, and we haven't really... you did touch on what the Wallace Line is for those who don't know, but Alfred Russel Wallace did a lot of work in that region, and then here we were keeping a nature journal, keeping a field journal, and I wonder how you feel about that. Do you feel connected with old naturalists of history when you're keeping your journals?
Well, the trite answer is yes, but some more than others. Darwin was... he came from a moneyed class. He'd never had to worry about whether or not he had a future, so to speak, from a very young age. It was his biggest problem was figuring out what he was going to do. And indeed, it may well be that he, because he was never trained as a biologist, he was self-taught. Mind you, so was Wallace. But the difference was, for a start, Darwin made one major field trip in his life, which was on the Beagle. And although it was a small ship, it was nevertheless a haven he could go back to after he'd been off looking for fossil mammals or whatever. He did take some ground trips, which is possibly where he got the infection which is supposed to have affected the rest of his life. Nevertheless, he could retreat to the Beagle and so on. But Wallace was quite different. He went in the field, found a house or a hut or a bivouac, and spent months and months and months in the field. He did keep journals. And they're interesting to read because they're on and off. Sometimes he'd write 3 lines for a day. Sometimes he'd write a whole essay. And he really, of course, he'd been in Brazil, in the Amazon, and he'd gone back to the UK, and his ship caught fire. And he was in a longboat in the middle of the Atlantic. I think it was in the middle of the Atlantic. But all his collections were lost from the Amazon. almost all. And he got back to the UK, and I mean, he was intending to sell these collections in order to keep himself alive. And he'd been there with Henry Bates. Bates stayed there. They split up when they got there. Bates wrote Naturalist on the River Amazons, whereas Wallace's book was called Travels on the Amazon. Anyway, doesn't matter. The point is that he rushed around, raised money, and took off again, this time for Southeast Asia, where he was away for several years. And I admired the fact that he picked himself up from losing everything and went off there and really thought about things. I think this is one reason why I wrote on people's journals often. I would really like to know what you thought, because he was collecting stuff, shooting birds, shooting mammals, whatever, skinning them, because he had to. That was how he made a living. And it was a slightly different world in terms of attitude. But nevertheless, he did write some really conservation-oriented things. And I've forgotten what I was going to say.
We were talking about feeling connected to.
Oh, that's right. Because there's a paper he wrote, a short, about 4 pages, which you can find online, called the Sarawak Law. And the Sarawak Law was written about 2 years before the famous paper or presentation with Darwin, which was all about the dynamics of speciation and evolution, the one that changed the world. But 2 years earlier, he wrote this thing called the Sarawak Law, and he reflected on the fact that whenever you found two animals or plants or insects that were clearly similar to each other, they were usually geographically close to each other as well. Now, bear in mind, this was before the theory of evolution. It was at a time when the accepted dogma was that God created the world and plunked things in place. So if God had created these two very similar things, why plunk them in the same place or close together? And of course, the reason that it actually is that is because many of them are derived from a common ancestor, which would also have been in that place, and some sort of isolation occurred, but on a local basis. And that Sarawak Law, which would have completely gazumped Darwin, was so close, but he admitted he didn't understand the mechanism. But he observed this. An amazing essay. It's only 3 pages, very easy to read. And then, of course, in Ternate, in the Moluccas, he had this
He realized
inspiration that
it was in the haze of a malarial fever, wasn't it? That
well,
he realized.
this is the story.
This is the story.
He was certainly convalescing after a bout of malaria, which is why he was in one place. And it was also, as he himself says somewhere, I think, that he actually had enforced leisure because he was so weak that he was thinking about things. And he says in a later paper he wrote for the Linnean Society 50 years after Darwin was dead, but 50 years after the 1858 revelation, or whenever it was. He says that one reason this all came to him was that he had time to think about it. He was alone. He wasn't being interrupted. He had read Malthus about population increase. He was fascinated by beetles, the most diverse group of insects, or one of them. But he said he figured out what was going on in terms of natural selection and speciation, and wrote it up as an essay and posted it off to England, all in about a 3-day period. Wow. Whereas poor old Darwin had been stewing on this for 20 years. Wallace didn't give a damn, because Wallace wasn't part of the British establishment. He wasn't married to a very religious woman, wasn't married to anybody at the time, but Darwin was. And although Emma Wedgwood really helped Darwin publish things late, especially later when Darwin was getting weak and debilitated and all the rest of it, and she did support him very strongly. But before Darwin went public with the idea, he had to cope with this mental burden that he was in a society that he knew he would offend, and he would offend to the very core of their thinking, and he would overturn 1,000 years of so-called understanding of how things were the way they were, and he would show that evolution was mechanistic. It wasn't supernatural, or the creation of species was not supernatural. It was a mechanism, and he was frightened of publishing that.
Yes, it must have been a very difficult decision.
Well, no, it was forced on him. It was
yes.
forced on him. It was forced on him because this letter for publication from Wallace arrived. And he thought, oh,
I'm going to miss out if I don't.
All of this information he had, there's no doubt he had the idea long before Wallace, but it wasn't published. A few people knew about it. Hooker, the director of Kew Gardens, knew about it. And in fact, Darwin was going to throw it all in and said, well, look, Wallace has done it. And it was Hooker and others that persuaded him that there should be this joint presentation. And of course, Wallace was very gracious about it all, because later in reflection, he would always cede precedence for the idea, which he didn't need to do. But I think he got a rough trot in that regard. So I was always far more sympathetic. And of course, I knew Southeast Asia very well. So I always felt this connection with Wallace. And the fact that he wrote journals and wrote extensively.
When we were out there in Borneo, it was such an incredible feeling to be out there. And I felt like something really big and important was happening. And I would write in this journal, and I regret that I didn't have fancy handwriting like the old naturalists that you see.
Oh, no. Darwin's handwriting was terrible. And mine has deteriorated. My writing when I was 17 is better than when I was 75. But again, generally speaking, you're tired. You're doing it in a hurry.
Yes.
You know.
But it's a wonder that they produce, like some of the old naturalists would create these masterworks in the evening by lamplight, that I just can't even fathom the work they did in the field in those conditions.
Yeah, well, they were tough cookies. there were plenty of them. You know, I've had students working in Borneo since your time as a student who are living in field camps, just in jungle dongas and this sort of thing, with mosquito nets. I've been there myself and visited with them, it's not that different from Wallace's situation. Of course, they did have occasional internet connection, which Wallace certainly didn't have. Interestingly, if he had had instantaneous connection with Darwin, he would probably never have written the article, because once he'd had the big idea, his instinct was to write it down in a formal fashion.
Yes.
Whereas now you would do what the Chinese guy did who sequenced COVID. He immediately emailed his mate in Melbourne or wherever it was and shared the file. And I have no idea who actually got the published credit for it.
Yes.
But, you know, if Wallace had been able to do that, the first thing he would have done, because he was so in awe of Darwin, because
Yes.
of the naturalist journal that Darwin had, The Voyage of the Beagle, the first thing he would have done would have spilled the beans to Darwin.
Yes.
Goodness knows what would have happened then.
Yes.
So there was some
history changed.
advantage in the slowness of the communication.
Roger, thank you so much for talking to me about all this. It's been so fun to chat about our trip, but also hear about your history and the importance of journals. And it's been so good. Thank you.
My pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this episode with Professor Roger Kitching. It was a very special experience for me to talk with him again, to hear about his own early nature experiences and experiences of his first expeditions and entry into his professional life. And it was especially beautiful to remember all the wonders of nature that we saw on the trip to Brunei all those years ago. There's one memory of that trip that I'd love to share, a moment of pure wonder. On the day we arrived at the Field Study Centre, while everyone was settling into their dorms and getting acquainted with the place, I went alone down to the river, the Sungai Belalong, which runs right in front of the Field Study Centre. I ventured upstream just a little way past a series of small rapids to a quiet little pool, and I remember so clearly sitting there alone in the water, and it was hot and humid, and there was dense tropical forest on the steep slopes on either side of me. I was completely in awe of where I was, alone in the rainforest in Borneo. I couldn't believe it. I just sat there for a moment, taking it in, not being able to believe where I was. And then a wind started to move through the trees, growing stronger and stronger. And then this magical thing happened. I didn't know it at the time, but this is a dipterocarp forest. And dipterocarps are trees that produce these incredible winged seeds that rotate as they're falling. And this is a way of dispersing further from the parent plant. So in that moment when the wind loosened hundreds of dipterocarp seeds from their position, and they started spinning and falling all at once, and they rained down on me while I was there in the water. And you could think of them like blades of a helicopter rotating, but I didn't think of them like that. To me, in that moment, they were dancers, hundreds of tiny ballet dancers pirouetting through the sky in the afternoon light in a tropical rainforest. I get goosebumps just remembering it because it was so completely amazing. I was completely in awe of what was happening. And it's one of those nature experiences that I'll always remember for the magic of it, for the purity of that sense of wonder that we can experience in nature. This will be our final episode for 2020. It's been a crazy roller coaster of a year, and I hope you're well and safe. Wherever you are and whatever you've been through this year, I'm sending you very best wishes and thoughts for a new start in 2021. New growth, positive changes, safety, and happiness. Thank you so much for listening this year. See you next week for a new episode and a new year.